Welcome to our introductory installation of strategic and tactical operations for Sorcerous Conflagrations. Considerations on the nature of execration and its implementation. When I was asked to give some thoughts on execration, more commonly referred to as cursing or denouncement, I began to think of it in the wider terms of magical or spiritual warfare, in terms of strategy and tactics. This led me to the first question of why execration? Why would one resort to spiritual means of effecting change in this nature? The most obvious answer is usually because direct physical confrontation has been ruled out for one reason or another. Or perhaps it will be done in combination with direct physical confrontation. It could be that the target is inaccessible, protected or privileged in some way. But also we have to consider that execration isn't just about inflicting some kind of standard harm. The purpose of execration need not be so mundane. This is especially true if we yoke our spiritual tactics to a wider strategy in our lives. If we are considering all our acts as intentional and under the direction of our life's purpose, then not all acts are in our best interest. Thus, we enter into the domain of strategic rather than simply tactical thinking. Let's look at the nature of execration. A curse itself can possess manifold character, from the act of killing, silencing, debilitating, or making infirm, to embarrass, to reveal hidden secrets, to exile, impoverish, or otherwise manipulate. It can be done by a single actor or in concert with a group of actors. It can be a single act or a series of acts. It can be done as a system of related acts or stages aiming to culminate in a final result. It can be directed at an individual or a group. Its aim also might be to manipulate an environment or an institution. Its motivations may be guided by self-interest, political, philosophical, ideological, or religious interest. It may be desired by the individual, or it may be a requirement of a collective interest. Cursing is as diverse as are its objects, its means, and its applications. Execration is itself manipulation, and that manipulation with hostile intent. We are utilizing our agency and the power to impose it over the express will and consent of another person or groups of persons. We should not shy away from what we are doing when speaking of this topic. Whether we are doing it solely for personal means or whether we are doing it driven by some political or ethical policy, what we are doing amounts to an act of violence. Whether this puts cursing in the same category as legitimate warfare or crime is deserving of an essay in and of itself, but this is outside the scope of today's considerations. If we move forward with execration as a species of spiritual warfare, then we should turn to theories of war, its conduct, and its tactical implementation. By doing this, we open up a world of preliminary considerations. Considerations which will have direct practical influence on our choice of tactics. It will also allow for an expansion of our options by looking at domains already explored in detail by various armed services. Another reason we must consider execration as warfare is because it is so often not a singular act or an isolated incident. As a practical consideration, professional magicians, witches, and other spiritual specialists frequently engage in the marketplace of spiritual services. Each act of manipulation contains the risk of running afoul of some other spiritual specialist. A request for a relationship separation may by skillful means be turned upon the original sender. The situation then multiplies to volleys of defense and attack that can escalate into more direct spiritual combat. If such a duel spreads to groups or houses of workers, then we have witnessed the escalation into full conflagration. It becomes warfare. This is always the potential backdrop for any act of execration, no matter how minor. This means our first question again must be why? What are our wider goals? What is our politic? What drives our actions? Who are we? Who is our opponent? Do some means fall into conflict with our wider goals, constitution, or means? These are the theoretical questions posed by Prussian general and military theorist Karl von Clausewitz in his influential work Vom Kriege, or On War. In a much wider version of this talk, I would emphasize in more detail the theory of strategy put forward by people like Clausewitz, Jomini, Moltke, Mao, and many others. Some absolutely excellent reviews of these thinkers can be found in Peter Perrett's book, Makers of Modern Strategy, From Machiavelli to the Nuclear Age. However, for now, I think some fundamental considerations by Clausewitz will suffice to illustrate how execration can go from the smash and grab of an angry impulse to a calculated method of overcoming opposition. Let us look at cursing as war. For Clausewitz, war is thus an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. For him, we might begin our considerations with the extreme facts of the theory. We are dealing with the unmitigated clash of force on force. But we can skip over the tautological elements of violence, which we are all familiar with, by simply underlining these basic fundamentals. For Clausewitz, disarming of the enemy must always be the fundamental goal of war, if you were to force them to do your bidding. They must be made literally defenseless or brought to that probable outcome. The enemy will resist, and that will to resistance must be broken. Otherwise, the opponent can always reorganize at a later date, more suited to their advantage. We must look at two foundational factors. One, the total means at our disposal, and two, the strength of our enemies to resist. With this first foundational factor, we see that we must know ourselves, our resources, our level of determination, our goals, and our natures. The first means at our disposal is self-knowledge, and indeed, one of our goals will be to deny to our opponent this knowledge that we possess, and which it is to our advantage that they do not possess. This both in the sense of denial of their knowledge of us, and to deny them the full knowledge of themselves. Mistakes made at this most axiomatic point of strategy account far more for failure even than the more advanced tactical mistakes. I do not mean simply the knowledge of a given curse or a spiritual system, but rather the knowledge of the protracted element, that is a true analysis of the end goal of the war, the access to and renewal of resources, and perhaps most importantly, the mental and constitutional self-makeup that one possesses to engage. These are all also considerations on the second foundation, that is, our enemy's strength to resist. When execration is looked at strategically, then these inventories are primary before any other considerations or actions are put into place. Because war is rarely a single or isolated act, there is frequently time for both sides of a conflict to size one another up, to gather information, for them to mobilize, entrench, or defend. It is this point that concerns intelligence, counterintelligence, information, and psychological warfare. A larger strategy of execration does not isolate the singular work of cursing. It prepares the ground long beforehand. It is the informational equivalent of soaking the battlefield in petrol before even meeting a duel. The more facade, false narrative, uncertainty, deflection, and fog about the nature and potential of your capabilities, the better. The object is to deny the enemy knowledge of your capabilities, location, reserves, assistance, allies, except where such knowledge serves a specific way to drive their behavior. Simultaneously, one must engage in data collection as a way of life. Divination is a typical method of information gathering, but it also must be remembered that there are methods of disturbing the divination of an opponent, of camouflaging one's own spiritual forces, of honeypotting or deflecting the true nature of your operations. Similar considerations may be applied to techniques like remote viewing. These types of skills should be honed long before anything approaching a direct spiritual force is applied. You should be ready for conflict to impact virtually any element of your life or the lives of your allies and loved ones. You need to consider what elements of your life are of sufficient value that you yourself could be driven to disarmament. What elements will cause you to relent the attack? Taking stock of the self is foremost in all successful combat. Because situations are frequently dynamic, and that every act changes the battlefield, successful execration is essentially tied into the manner of living. All available means must be capable of supporting the war aims. A nation or person whose economy is unfit for war will not wage it very long, and engaging in actions that disturb one's wider life goals will similarly become vulnerable. This brings us to what might be called the political object. Clausewitz is famous for having said, "War is merely the continuation of policy by other means." The political object is the goal. War is the means of reaching it, and means can never be considered in isolation from their purpose. This is what is meant by strategy. Strategy is the implementation of the total means at our disposal to complete our political object. Naturally, the political object is itself in subservience to our life goals or community dictates, as the case may be. When we speak of tactics, such as those involved in attacks, information warfare, psychological warfare, poisoning, necromancy, spirit-mediated violence, confusion, etc., we are talking about the exact means at our disposal and the best method to force the submission of our opponent's will. These are our tactics. Clausewitz defines war as a trinity of primordial force and violence, with the play of chance and probability, under the subordination and submission to policy. This is what, for Clausewitz, gives war a rational factor above and beyond the simple clash of force versus force. The tactical element is our ability to deal with chance, to adapt to changing conditions, to our ignorance or our blindness in the heat of battle, to calculate the probable behavior of our opponent and to counteract it. Tactics are designed to address specific sub-goals in our combat. We may turn to so-called spells of invisibility in the Greek magical papyri, such as PGM 1, 222-31, to engage in lowering the attention we draw. Or we might use PGM 4, 467-68 to restrain anger, so that we might buy ourselves more time to develop our plans. We might use similar spells in the PGM to send dreams of misdirection, to make an opponent who we know divines by dreams suspect their enemy is someone else entirely. These tactics of deflection do not themselves defeat an enemy in total, but are supporting actors in their final submission. This is always more important when the hyena seeks to fell the lion. If working with a group of trusted practitioners, one can divide the labor and quickly overwhelm an opponent's ability to exactly define who the real opponent is in the first place. Regardless of what is chosen, the political object should drive the strategy, and the strategy must choose the tactics. You may very well be capable of creating a splashy and inconvenient experience for an opponent by a rash direct attack. However, if you have misjudged their ability to adapt or the resources they have at their disposal, you may find yourselves not only exposed, but unprepared for continual conflict. You must ensure that by your actions, you do not win the battle just to lose the war. This brings me to what might be called the prestige element of spiritual warfare, or the Andy Kaufman element. We are talking about the total engagement of the life of the sorcerer to such capabilities. This does not mean the sorcerer should think of life as a dress rehearsal for war or for execration, but rather maintenance of one's potential for agency. This relates to the first foundational principle of taking stock of the means of disposal. We look to the maintenance of our spiritual guides, our pacts, our relationships. We look to our access to materials, to forging networks of material holders that we can draw upon. We look to obscuring our resources from prying eyes. We look to access to places of working, to obscuring those places, to obscuring even many of our most foundational practices in these regards. Not every element of our arsenal need be strictly magical. It is a terrible mistake to rely solely on spiritual means in a conflict. As a random example, it was popular in the 90s to use autodialers to ring the phones of a target at all hours of the night to interfere with their sleep, or to engage in phishing attacks by phone to gather information. Today, we have so many means of electronic cybernetic warfare that it seems at least as worthy of study as some of the methods in Agrippa or the Picatrix. I would even go as far as to suggest that there are some magical analogs to much of the FRAC 2600 style attacks on computers and phone systems. When we start to look at the problem from an electronic or cybersecurity perspective, we can come up with unique and less predictable methods of damaging an opponent. With regards to the Kaufman or prestige methods, another example would be using elements like social media to create a falsified perspective of your activities. One could keep a folder of relatively recent photos of a vacation that you have kept secret. These are posted as a current event, as in an alibi, when one is actually engaging in astrologically timed magic. This way, should the opponent suppose they are suffering from a certain affliction, any of their social media lurking will not give the impression that a given election is likely. Another example, used in some traditions, is to cover the physical body of the active spiritual weapon with other spiritually charged plants or similar deflections. The use of mirrors around a space or other sensitive materials are leveraged to give a false sense to the divinatory abilities of the enemy. All of the above is more or less what we mean by counterintelligence and information warfare. For those interested in an introduction to information warfare, I highly recommend Information Operations, Warfare and the Hard Reality of Soft Power by Leigh Armistead. Looking to a Rand Corporation essay entitled The Zapatista Social Net War in Mexico, we read, quote, "Information power is also hard to categorize because it cuts across all other military, economic, social, and political power resources, in some cases diminishing their strength and in others multiplying it. We should not underestimate the ability for modern technological efforts to disguise or enhance our efforts in spiritual warfare. There is an absolute reason why billions of dollars are traded on information technology, for the data of individuals, and that data useful in predicting the likely behavior of a target. Again, in concert with Clausewitz, calculating probabilities and chance is at the heart of tactical operations. However, information warfare is not just for deflection or for obfuscation. As pointed out in Strategic Information Warfare Rising, a paper by Roger C. Molander et al., and prepared for the Office of the Secretary of Defense by Rand, information warfare can be used to undermine economic interests, infrastructures, access to resources, or to directly undermine a coalition or ally. In direct attacks via social media or the like, this may be used to deny a target access to some resource. It might be to cause changes in public opinion. It might be to cause a loss of confidence in providing services, or any number of political maneuvers. Spiritual information warfare might include an incredible increase in signal noise. This would be making sure that the opponent is inundated with relatively innocuous spiritual influences, such that the clarity on the nature of the conflict is hard to assess. If the goal was to economically bleed an opponent, then this would become readily noticed, unless the attacker had prepared a myriad of other small inconveniences to accompany the real thrust. This also verges into the domain of psychological warfare. It is obvious that an excessively occupied or stressed individual is far more likely to make mistakes than someone with ease of time. The signal noise participates in the confusion, but it has the added benefit of increasing stress. Direct psychological warfare might include everything from restlessness or insomnia spells from the Greek magical papyri to contracts with spirits of confusion and anxiety as found in the legions of Kimbanda. An otherwise powerful enemy might be psychologically reliant on a romantic partner, and by denying them that emotional security, render them pliant to all manner of ills. Directly manipulating the mind of a seasoned practitioner might quickly cause them to seek medicine. However, a disturbed relationship might go undiagnosed as anything other than life's typical disasters. If the target is financially reliant on this person, then you've potentially doubled the economy of the attack. As an example, one might petition Tata Caveira or Eshu Borcego to fuel the enemy's desire for an addiction, and thus fueling a sticking point in a fragile relationship. Anxiety disorders are crippling and can directly deter the willingness of an enemy to engage in their practice. Contracting spirits like Eshu Asa Negra could be useful for such a tactic. For those interested in psychological warfare and its relationship to strategy, I recommend a book by Janos Radvani et al. Called Psychological Operations and Political Warfare in Long-Term Strategic Planning. As this text points out, psychological operations are maintained in long-term strategic planning, both in war and peacetime, and much of the infrastructure is continual. Another word on psychological warfare. It does not solely include propaganda or information-like operations. As Alfred Paddock Jr. discusses, quote, a more sophisticated PSYOPs planning capability would allow the services to more effectively employ psychological actions. Those actions carried out primarily for their psychological effect, sometimes called propaganda of the deed. These are activities that do not normally involve the use of printed or audiovisual media to disseminate the propaganda message, but which are planned to have a psychological impact. What might this look like? Suppose your tactic was one of intimidation rather than subterfuge, and your wider strategy was one of terror with regards to your potential future actions. In such a strategy, one which does not rely on positive public relations, classic curses like rolling the head of a goat that has been sacrificed to the spirits into a crowded discotheque with the name of the target stuffed in the mouth might serve such a dramatic end. This is in the same species of terrorist magic, such as nailing a tongue to the door of the victim or utilizing ritualistic arson. As with all such tactics, they come at a considerable potential cost. The evaluation of these costs should have already been calculated as a part of a general strategy long before the conflagration. We should also note that for Clausewitz, defense is a stronger position than offense. Vietnam, Afghanistan, and currently Ukraine offer excellent examples of this. It costs an enemy a great deal of effort and resources to engage a fortified position. The longer they are forced to engage without recovery, the weaker their position becomes, and the worse off they are during countermaneuvers. So if you are a practitioner with whatever species of protections, those must first be overcome to get at you. The proper maintenance of such things is largely responsible for the failure of many offensive campaigns. In fact, practitioners, like nations, can be brought to ruin by excessive waging of offensive campaigns against an entrenched enemy. If combat was not initiated by you, the longer you can remain in a purely defensive position without diminution, the greater the damage to the offensive party. Thus, one feeling confused or disoriented might find by divination that this brain fog has its origins in witchcraft, and so they turn to some force of coolness, clarity, and wisdom, like Obatala. One might need to remain in their fortified palace while they feel they are under attack, but turn to a spirit that tracks witchcraft and reveals it. In such a case, an Olarisha might seek out Ochosi so that they can again be free to travel. The specific methods will depend on the background of the person, but the reason we are talking generally is because the theory of strategy and tactics remains the same and can be applied accordingly. Returning from various operations we might choose to engage, we should also talk about information gathering and applying biographic information to curse work. A simple example might suffice. In the case of astrological magic, one might obtain the time, date, and place of the opponent's birth, and having analyzed their chart, choose to engage them in their excesses or deficiencies. A person with aberrant desires could be driven to such excess in those matters that they become the object of public ridicule or scorn. Perhaps they take a vice to the point of death, or perhaps they are driven to speak far too openly about unfair dealings or other suspect activity. One example of such a method would be to calculate the humoral balance of a person, and using unguents or scents, such as those given by Reverend Father Sinistrari of Amino in his inquisitional text, Demonality, attract to them a parasitic spirit, more commonly known as an incubi or succubi. Another example is environmental magic, poisoning, and the like. When places the target haunts are known, it opens up options for creating adverse situations. Even where one might not be able to fell the bull directly, they may be able to enrage the spirits of the location. If the target frequents, say, the local Kurgerbing, the location could be magically poisoned by violence, by a talisman buried by the door. An example of a related talisman can be found in Book 1, Chapter 5 of the Picatrix, as translated by John Michael Greer and Christopher Warnock. Now, of course, these area effects will have consequences for others as well, and that has to be factored into the political object. With knowledge of the target's domicile location or employment location, one can perhaps narrow the collateral damage. If one's overall strategy doesn't involve being perceived as a warlord or a terrorist, then engaging in these types of broad area attacks needs to be delivered with as much stealth as possible. Overall, the whole landscape is open for discussion. While you might successfully perturb a target's divination, it doesn't prevent them from seeking help. Knowing an opponent's associations, allies, or even where and with whom they might seek assistance is another advantage. This is another reason why the act of excursion shouldn't be considered a singular moment. Eventually, any spiritually minded person is going to seek a solution to what has been done, and the most common response is, of course, a return to sender. One must have protocols for such an event. Further, many are functioning as spiritual communities, where an attack on one triggers the defense by all. If you are unaware of your opponent's true affiliations, how can you hope to overcome their will to resistance? All of this falls under what is sometimes called IPB, or Intelligence Preparation of the Battle Space. If one cannot maintain dominance, then they are forced to resort to low visibility and subterfuge. The less you know about your opponent's operation, the more care must be taken to remain anonymous, to deflect attention, or to seem harmless. The bully on the block is always suspected, and while there are advantages to ostentatious displays of power, this must be backed up by an unencumbered ability to attack. Ignorance of the nature and reserves of your opponent is by definition encumbered. Since arrogance in this function is fatal, and knowledge cannot absolutely be determined, as a general rule of strategy, some level of low visibility or clandestine action is to be preferred. This is in accord with the Kaufman doctrine. Intelligence agencies frequently engage in clandestine activity which, though judged necessary, could significantly damage the strategic goals of a nation. Similarly, a practitioner that prides themselves on ethical engagement could easily find that perception tarnished should certain clandestine activities come to light. It goes without saying that the fourth power of the Sphinx is silence. But sometimes silence is not enough. Active camouflaging, shape-shifting, even aposematism may serve the larger strategy. Again, there is no hard rule, as all is subservient to the political object. Lastly, examples of tactical implementation set aside, the final component of a theory of warfare that I'd like to address is character, temperament, or virtues. Let's talk about the execrationist as commander. What should be their qualities? These are the internal virtues that make one efficient and strong in spiritual warfare. In the chapter on military genius, Karl von Clausewitz writes, "Genius consists in a harmonious combination of elements, in which one or the other ability may predominate, but none may be in conflict with the rest." For Clausewitz, strategy and military genius do not lie in one singular gift. It is the way we work our gifts together as a unit. For Clausewitz, it is obvious that intelligence and courage play a part in the commander, but even these contain subtleties. He notes of courage, for example, it contains two parts: courage in the face of personal danger, but also courage to accept responsibility. The best courage is of both natures. Further, he states that war is the realm of physical exertion and suffering. These will destroy us unless we become indifferent to them. But those who become accustomed to war will quickly notice it is truly the domain of the powers of the intellect. Warfare cannot be successfully waged as brute, dumb, or unthinking. It should not be rash or unplanned. Further, the commander is open to chance and adaptability. Situations change and are dynamic. There is a fog of war. The ability to handle uncertainty is fundamental. Clausewitz writes, "If the mind is to emerge unscathed from this relentless struggle with the unforeseen, two qualities are indispensable. First, an intellect that, even in the darkest hour, retains some glimmerings of the inner light which leads to truth. And second, the courage to follow this light wherever it may lead. To follow this through is the quality of determination. It is physical courage, but also moral courage. Clausewitz says the role of determination is to limit the agonies of doubt and the perils of hesitation when the motives for action are inadequate. Further, determination allows for presence of mind, to be present in the moment, and to act quickly in the face of a new uncertainty, to adapt with skill and speed. Terms like energy, firmness, emotional balance, strength of character. Clausewitz writes, these products of a heroic nature could almost be treated as one and the same force, strength of will, which adjusts itself to circumstances. This is like the will of the soft reed to bend with the water, and not the will of the strong rock that is eroded by it. Strength and adaptability to the truth of the situation. Lastly, perhaps a controversial character trait, but one which both Clausewitz and my personal experience convince me of, is that of the spirit of endeavor, or even ambition. As a form of strength, I would call it lust. As with all qualities, they have their malignancies in excess, when the traits are outside the harmonious balance with other qualities. This is striving in competitive enthusiasm that provides the energy for contest. Clausewitz chastises the German language for associating words like honor with Ruhmsucht, translated as a hankering after glory. He is quoted as saying, "The abuse of these noble ambitions has certainly inflicted the most disgusting outrages on the human race. Nevertheless, their origins entitle them to be ranked among the most elevated in human nature. In war, they act as the essential breath of life that animates the inert mass." He says it is primarily the spirit of endeavor on the part of the commander at all levels, this inventiveness, energy, and competitive enthusiasm, which vitalizes an army and makes it victorious. And so far as the commander-in-chief is concerned, we may well ask whether history has ever known a great general who was not ambitious, whether indeed such a figure is conceivable. But beyond all this, Clausewitz believes that if we ask ourselves, what sort of mind is likely to display the qualities of military genius, he answers that it is an inquiring mind rather than the creative mind, the comprehensive rather than the specialized approach, the calm rather than the excitable head to which in war we choose to entrust the fate of our brothers and children and the safety and honor of our country.